He built an empire worth $3 billion, and not $1 of it could undo the 6 years of silence between them. 6 years since the argument that ended everything. 6 years since he told himself she would call when she was ready to apologize, and she never called. And he never called either, because pride is a wall two people can build from opposite sides without ever meaning to finish it. He thought he understood loss. He thought a man who had survived a hostile takeover, a market crash, and the slow, grinding climb from nothing to everything understood what it meant to lose something and keep standing. He did not understand anything yet. Not until the afternoon he stepped out of a car on a downtown street he hadn't walked in years and saw a woman kneeling on a flattened cardboard box outside a train station, a paper cup in front of her, and recognized, underneath years of hardship that had changed almost everything about her, his own mother's face. And not until he knelt in front of her, said her name, and she looked at him with eyes that held no memory of him at all, and said, quietly, like an apology to a stranger, "I don't have a son. Stay with me." This is a story about how easily we let the people who made us disappear and what it costs to find them again after the world has already taken almost everything from them. Daniel Cross was 39 years old, and for the last decade his name had meant something in rooms most people never entered. He'd built Crossline Logistics out of a single delivery van and a spreadsheet full of impossible math, and now it moved freight across 4 continents and employed nearly 9,000 people. He owned a penthouse with a view of the whole city glittering below him like something he'd earned the right to look down on. He had a calendar that filled itself faster than he could clear it, and a reputation, in every boardroom he entered, for being the calmest man in the room no matter what was on fire around him. None of it mattered on that particular gray Thursday afternoon. His driver had taken a detour around a street closure near the old train station, a part of downtown Daniel rarely had reason to pass through anymore, and Daniel happened to glance out the window at the exact moment his life split into a before and an after. An elderly woman knelt on a flattened piece of cardboard against the cold stone wall of the station, a paper cup in front of her holding a handful of coins, a threadbare coat wrapped around a frame that had once stood straight and now curved inward like something folded too many times. Daniel told the driver to stop before he understood why. Something in the posture, the tilt of the head, the particular way her hands were folded in her lap, snagged at a part of his memory he hadn't opened in years. He told himself it couldn't be her. He told himself 100 things in the 4 seconds it took to open the car door and cross the sidewalk, and every one of them fell apart the moment he was close enough to see her face. It was Vivian Cross, his mother. Older, thinner, weathered by a version of hardship he could not yet imagine, but unmistakably her. The same high cheekbones, the same small scar above her left eyebrow from a kitchen accident when he was 6, the same way she pressed her lips together when she was cold and didn't want to complain about it. He knelt in front of her right there on the concrete, oblivious to the pedestrians stepping around them, oblivious to his own driver standing frozen by the open car door with his hand still on the handle. "Mom," Daniel said, and his voice cracked on the single word the way it hadn't cracked in a boardroom in 15 years. "Mom, it's me. It's Daniel." She looked at him the way a person looks at a stranger who has mistaken them for someone else. Polite, apologetic, a little wary, the practiced caution of someone who has learned that strangers on the street are not always kind. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said, and her voice was gentle, almost soothing, as though she were the one comforting him. "I don't have a son." The words landed in him like a blade turned sideways, twisting on the way in. He had spent 6 years imagining 100 different versions of what it might feel like to see her again. Anger, forgiveness, a slow, careful rebuilding. Maybe even a door closed in his face if she was still as hurt as he deserved her to be. He had never once imagined this. The woman who raised him alone after his father left, who worked 2 jobs so he could stay in school instead of dropping out to help pay rent, looking directly into his eyes and finding absolutely nothing there. To understand how a mother ends up on a sidewalk not recognizing her own son, you have to go back 6 years, to a small kitchen in a rented house in a town Daniel had left behind the moment his company took off. The argument that broke them wasn't really about money, though money was the language it got spoken in. Vivian had asked Daniel, gently, carefully, the way she asked for everything in her life, whether he might help cover the cost of a new furnace before winter. She hadn't asked easily. She'd rehearsed the question for days. Daniel would later learn, turning it over until it felt small enough to say out loud without sounding like a burden. Daniel, drowning in a funding round that had consumed his every waking hour for 3 months, sleep-deprived and short-tempered in a way he told himself was temporary, had said something he would spend 6 years regretting. Something about how she needed to learn to manage on her own, the way he'd had to. He hadn't meant it the way it sounded. He'd meant it the way exhausted, overextended people mean things they don't fully hear themselves say. Words fired off in the middle of a bad week that land with a permanence the speaker never intends. But Vivian, who had spent her whole life being told, gently and otherwise, to manage on her own, heard it exactly the way it was said. She told him she wouldn't ask him for anything again. He told her that was probably for the best, the kind of thing a person says when they're too proud and too tired to take back words that are already halfway out the door. Neither of them called back to take the sentence apart and put it together differently. Neither of them said the small, ordinary things that might have ended it that same week. I didn't mean that. I'm sorry of. Course I'll help. Pride is patient. It waits as long as you let it, and Daniel and Vivian let it wait for 6 years. At first, the silence felt almost manageable, the kind of thing Daniel assumed would resolve itself the moment either of them got over being stubborn. He told himself she would call once she'd cooled off. She told a cousin, in a conversation Daniel would only learn about much later, that she didn't want to be the one to call first this time, not after everything she'd already given up asking for over the years. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into a year, then 2, each one making the silence a little more permanent simply by virtue of having lasted that long. There is a particular kind of momentum to not calling someone. The longer it goes on, the harder the first call feels, until eventually the silence stops being a choice either person is actively making and becomes simply the shape of the relationship. What Daniel didn't know, because nobody had called to tell him, and he hadn't called to ask, was that 18 months after that conversation, Vivian had a fall in her kitchen that left her with a head injury the doctors called mild, and the years that followed proved was not. It happened on an ordinary evening. She was reaching for a pot on a high shelf, the same shelf she'd reached into 1,000 times without incident, and her footing slipped on a wet patch near the sink. She struck her head on the edge of the counter on the way down. A neighbor found her nearly 2 hours later, having noticed her porch light hadn't turned off at its usual time, and called an ambulance. The emergency room ran scans, found what they described as a mild concussion with no immediate danger, and sent her home with instructions to rest and follow up if symptoms persisted. Nobody flagged it as anything more serious. Nobody, crucially, called her son, because her emergency contact information listed a number that had changed twice since the last time anyone had updated it. The symptoms did persist, quietly, incrementally, in ways that are easy to miss when there's no one checking in regularly enough to notice a pattern. Small gaps in her memory at first, the kind she joked about, the kind everyone assumes is just getting older, misplacing keys, forgetting a name mid-sentence, losing track of what day it was. Then larger ones. She lost the rental house when she could no longer keep steady work, the 2 part-time jobs she'd relied on slipping away one after another as the gaps in her memory made her employers uneasy. She moved in with a cousin for a while, sharing a small apartment 2 towns over, until the cousin passed away suddenly of a heart condition and no one else in the family had room, or made room, because the family had scattered the way families do when no one is holding the center together anymore. Siblings spread across 3 states, none of them in regular enough contact to notice how badly Vivian was slipping, each one assuming, if they thought about it at all, that someone else was checking in. By the time she ended up on a cardboard box outside a train station, the injury and the years and the isolation had taken so much of her memory that even her own name sometimes came to her slowly, like something surfacing from deep water. In the particular cruelty of the injury, the thing it had erased most completely was the 6 most recent years of her life, which meant it had erased Daniel almost entirely, along with the wound he'd left in her, and the wound the world had left in both of them since. Daniel didn't understand any of this yet, kneeling on the sidewalk. All he understood was that his mother was looking at him with kind, apologetic eyes and telling him she had no son, and something in his chest was breaking apart in a way no acquisition or lawsuit or market crash had ever managed to break it. "Ma'am," he said carefully, forcing his voice steady, crouching so he was level with her instead of looming over her the way strangers on sidewalks so often did. "Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated, the way a person hesitates when a question that should be simple isn't. "Vivian," she finally said, testing the word like it belonged to someone else. "Vivian Cross, I think. It's been a while since anyone's asked. It's been a while since anyone's asked." 6 words that told Daniel everything about how alone she had been and how long. He didn't press her further on the sidewalk. He called for an ambulance, then called his own physician, then sat beside his mother on the cold concrete, holding a cup of coffee he'd bought from the station kiosk, talking to her gently about nothing in particular. The weather, the pigeons gathering near the station steps, anything that didn't require her to reach for a memory that wasn't there, while she thanked him, a stranger who happened to be kind to her, for the coffee and the company, in a tone so genuinely grateful it nearly undid him completely. At the hospital, a neurologist named Dr. Patel sat with Daniel in a small consultation room and explained, carefully and without false comfort, what the scans and the history suggested. A traumatic brain injury from the fall 2 years earlier, worsened significantly by years without proper treatment or follow-up care, worsened further by chronic stress, malnutrition, and prolonged isolation, all of which, Dr. Patel explained, actively accelerate cognitive decline in ways a stable, supported recovery environment can sometimes partially reverse memory loss that was significant but, Dr. Patel said carefully, not necessarily permanent in every respect. The brain, especially with stability, proper nutrition, medical care, and time, could sometimes recover pathways that trauma and neglect had closed off. There were no guarantees. But there was a chance, and a chance was more than Daniel had let himself hope for in the 4 hours since he'd knelt on that sidewalk. Daniel sat in a hospital hallway that night, long after visiting hours ended, and did something he hadn't let himself do in 6 years. He cried, not for the mother who didn't remember him, but for every phone call he hadn't made in the years when she still would have. Daniel didn't tell Vivian who he was again for the first several weeks. Dr. Patel advised against forcing the memory. Pushing too hard, too fast, could cause real distress and confusion, and there was no guarantee the memory would return on any schedule but its own, if it returned at all. So Daniel became, in his mother's eyes, a kind stranger who had taken an unusual interest in her recovery. He paid for a private room at the best facility in the state, one specializing in geriatric brain injury and trauma-informed memory care. He hired round-the-clock nursing support and personally interviewed every physical therapist and counselor on her care team. He sat with her every evening after his board meetings ended, no matter how late, learning to introduce himself fresh each time with a gentleness that cost him something new every single day. "Hi, I'm Daniel. I've been helping look after things while you get stronger," and learning to let her tell him stories about a son named Daniel that she sometimes remembered in fragments, disconnected from the man sitting across from her. She told him about a boy who loved trains, who used to press his face against the window every time one passed. She told him about a boy who once built an entire pretend delivery route out of cardboard boxes in the backyard, assigning himself routes and schedules with a seriousness that made the neighbors laugh. She told this kind stranger, more than once, that she was sure her son must be somewhere out there doing something wonderful, because he'd always had that kind of drive in him, even as a small boy stacking boxes in the grass. Every time she said it, Daniel had to look away so she wouldn't see his face. In those weeks of quiet, patient visits, Daniel learned things about the 6 years he'd missed that no phone call would ever have told him. He hired a private investigator, not out of suspicion, but out of a desperate need to understand exactly how far his mother had fallen while he was building glass towers 3 states away. He learned about the furnace that never got fixed and the winter after that one, colder still, that she'd spent wrapped in every blanket she owned. He learned about the fall and the emergency room visit no one had thought to flag as serious, and the outdated emergency contact number that meant no one had ever called him. He learned about the slow unraveling of a life that had no one checking in to catch it, the lost jobs, the lost apartment, the cousin who died and left her with nowhere steady to land. He learned that the family members he'd assumed were looking after her hadn't been, not out of cruelty, but out of the same quiet, everyday failure to show up that he himself had been guilty of. An aunt who meant to visit and kept postponing. A cousin who sent a check once and assumed that was enough. Nobody had done anything monstrous. Everybody had simply looked away, one small decision at a time, until a woman who had given everything to raise a son alone ended up with nothing and no one. Daniel found this both the hardest and the most clarifying thing he'd ever learned about his own family and about himself. It would have been easier, in some ways, to discover a villain, someone to blame cleanly, someone whose cruelty explained everything. Instead, he found a slow accumulation of ordinary absence, the same absence he himself had practiced for 6 years without ever thinking of it as anything as serious as neglect. It was neglect. He made himself sit with that word until it stopped feeling like an exaggeration. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, 11 weeks into her recovery, in a rehabilitation garden behind the care facility Daniel had helped fund into a quieter, more personal campus than any standard hospital wing could offer. Raised flower beds lined the walking paths, chosen specifically because gardening had shown measurable benefit for patients relearning routine and sequence. Vivian was working with a physical therapist on a walking exercise, steadier on her feet with each passing week, and Daniel was sitting on a bench nearby, the way he sat most afternoons now, his laptop closed beside him for once, when she stopped mid-step and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen in 11 weeks. Not confusion, not the practiced politeness she'd shown 100 kind strangers, but something sharper, something reaching. "You keep coming here," she said slowly, working the words out like stepping stones. "Every day? Nobody keeps coming every day unless—" She stopped. Her hand went to her chest. Daniel. He was on his feet before he knew he'd moved, his chair scraping back against the gravel path. "Yeah, Mom. It's me." She started crying before she finished standing up straight, and the therapist had to help steady her, and Daniel crossed the garden in 3 long strides and held his mother the way he should have held her 6 years and 11 weeks and a lifetime of missed phone calls earlier. "I'm sorry," she kept saying, over and over, though she had absolutely nothing to be sorry for, the apology tumbling out of some deep, wounded instinct she'd never quite lost even when she'd lost everything else. "I'm sorry, I couldn't remember you. I'm so sorry." "Don't," Daniel said, his voice breaking apart completely now, right there in the garden, in front of the therapist and 2 other patients and anyone else who happened to be watching. "Don't you dare apologize to me. I'm the one who's sorry. I'm the one who let 6 years happen. You didn't do anything but survive something I wasn't there to help you survive." The memory didn't return all at once, and some of it never fully did. Certain months stayed permanently blurred. Certain details Vivian would spend the rest of her life reconstructing from photographs and stories rather than direct recall. But the essential thing came back. She knew her son. She knew the shape of him, the sound of his voice, the particular way he stood with his weight forward when he was working up the courage to say something difficult. Daniel moved her, once she was strong enough, into a house he built a few miles from his own. Not a mansion, though he could have built one twice over without noticing the cost, but a warm single-story home with wide doorways for the walker she still sometimes needed, a garden she could tend at her own pace with raised beds that didn't require kneeling, and a guest room that stayed permanently made up because he had learned, in the ugliest way possible, exactly what it cost to let too much. Time passed between visits. He didn't try to buy back 6 years with money. He tried to buy them back with Tuesdays. Every single Tuesday, without exception, no matter what was happening at Crossline, a funding round, a shipping crisis, an emergency board call, Daniel had dinner with his mother. He learned to cook the meals she used to make him as a boy, badly at first, burning a pot roast so completely the smoke detector went off twice in one evening, then well enough that she stopped laughing at his attempts and started actually complimenting them. He listened to every story she told, even the ones he'd heard a dozen times, because he understood now that listening was the thing he'd stopped doing long before the accident ever took her memory. He'd stopped showing up in the ordinary, unglamorous ways that actually build a relationship, long before geography or pride ever entered into it. Slowly, the house filled with small rituals that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with presence. Sunday morning phone calls just to hear her voice, a standing invitation for her to sit in on his company's smaller team dinners because she liked meeting the people he worked with, a shelf in her new living room dedicated entirely to photographs from the years she'd lost. which Daniel and a few surviving family members helped her reconstruct piece by piece, story by story, until the gaps felt less like holes and more like chapters she simply hadn't reread yet. A year after that afternoon on the sidewalk, Daniel stood at a groundbreaking ceremony for something he'd named, over his mother's soft objection that it was too much, the Vivian Cross Center, a facility combining emergency shelter, memory care support, and a rapid response program designed to reconnect isolated elderly people with family members who didn't yet know how badly they were needed. The idea had come to him in that hospital hallway the first night, sitting with the specific, unbearable knowledge that his mother was not the only parent who had disappeared, one small unanswered phone call at a time, into a version of loneliness nobody chose and everybody somehow allowed. The center's rapid response program worked with hospitals, shelters, and social workers across the region, using updated contact protocols and a dedicated outreach team to catch exactly the kind of gap that had swallowed his mother, the outdated emergency contact, the family member who assumed someone else was checking in, the small early fall or hospital visit that never got flagged as the beginning of something larger. Within its first year, the program had already reconnected 11 families who had drifted into the same kind of silence Daniel and Vivian had lived inside for 6 years. Vivian cut the ribbon herself, steady on her feet now, her memory imperfect, but her voice sure and warm in front of the small crowd gathered for the opening. "I don't remember all of it," she told them, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. "There are pieces of my own life I'll never get back, and I've made my peace with that. But I remember my son's face on that sidewalk, the day he found me. I remember that even when I couldn't recognize him, he didn't leave. That's the only piece of memory a person really needs. In the end, not every detail, just knowing there's someone who won't let go of you, even when you can't hold on to yourself." This story is fictional, but the pattern beneath it happens to real families every single day, in quieter, less dramatic ways than a sidewalk and a paper cup. An aging parent slowly slipping out of reach while everyone assumes someone else is checking in, a small argument that hardens into years of silence because neither side wants to be the one who calls first, a wall built one unanswered phone call at a time until neither person quite remembers how it started, only that it's still standing. If there's someone in your life you haven't spoken to because of pride or distance, or a wound neither of you has found the words to close, don't wait for the version of this story where you find out too late. Pick up the phone. Show up on an ordinary Tuesday, for no reason at all except that showing up is the whole point. Vivian Cross lost 6 years of memory to an injury no one saw coming. Daniel Cross lost 6 years of his mother's life to a silence he could have ended at any moment with a single phone call. Between the two of them, only one loss was ever truly unavoidable. Tell me in the comments, have you ever let pride keep you from reaching out to someone you loved? Or found your way back to someone after years of silence? I want to hear your story. And before you go, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel and how many different places are out there listening. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder to make that call today. Subscribe and turn on notifications. There's another story coming soon, and you won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching. May you never let silence become the story someone else tells about your love.